Our next speaker is Laura James. She's the technical director of Doteveryone and the co-founder of FieldReady. Thank you, Laura.
Hey, folks. So I'm Laura, and I'm an engineer. And I became an engineer because I wanted to make things better in the world through technology. And that's a value that I still hold today. And I want to talk a little bit about what that means to me in relation to open. I should say I'm going to make some assumptions about you, my audience, and internet audience as well. I'm assuming that you're all people who are pretty into open, that you maybe use open to describe what you do, and I'm also assuming this feels like quite an academic audience, so apologies, I'm talking less about open access probably than about other forms of open instead. So, once upon a time, I worked at Open Knowledge, and we spread the word of open. We did all kinds of projects, technical projects, community building projects, ran events, all sorts of things. And a lot of it was very successful during the time I was there, 2011 through 2014. We started new festivals, we got great success with CCAN in government. Open access really started to transform during that time. And there were nascent activities as well that you may be less familiar with. Open design, open hardware, open product information. And open knowledge as a movement really felt like it was growing. There were things like the Open Data Institute appearing, so new institutions, and lots of stuff going on. And we had this very powerful vision, which is actually not particularly about open as much as it was about empowering people and enabling folks around the world, not just elites, but everyone, to be more in control of their lives. At the same time, certainly for me by 2014, you could kind of see there were clouds on the horizon in the open movement. Things were not so easy. Early projects that had been running for a long time were not delivering the kind of impact that you might have hoped. We were still seeing a lot of pilot projects, less things translating through into the mainstream that you might have wanted. We had this tagline that some folks used of open by default. And that seemed quite challenging as folks in the wider world started to worry more about personal data and privacy and security. Open by default kind of is worrying if your first thought of data is personal information about you. And for all of the sense that we had a movement and were building a movement, we didn't seem to be getting very mainstream. The message was quite complex, would very quickly dive into conversations about licensing and things. And open as a word means many things to many people, not just what it means to those in this room. And so it became clear we were going to need a lot more advocacy and networking to take this forward. So by the end of 2014, I stepped down, leaving open knowledge to folks far more qualified to take it forward. And I thought I would take a year out to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. I thought at the time it might be something to do with open, as I had that experience, or maybe something to do with personal data, privacy and security. I actually ended up doing a bunch of different things. I'm going to talk about the two things that I've settled on I'm doing at the moment, both of which have open in them, but where open really isn't a headline item. So, FieldReady. FieldReady is a non-profit organization, something like a startup NGO, and we're transforming the way humanitarian supplies are delivered by manufacturing things in the field. Today, between 60 and 80% of the humanitarian aid budget goes on logistics, procurement, warehousing, all that sort of stuff. And yet folks, after disasters or in refugee camps, often don't have the items they need for months or even years, if at all. And we're changing that by making supplies in the field at point of need, using digital manufacturing technologies. And we have a grand vision of empowering people, a world where communities have access to everything they need to make essential supplies after a disaster. A world where aid agencies work very differently to today, much more connected on the ground. And a world where aid is more efficient and more effective, because we've shown we can make things in the field more cheaply than shipping from overseas. So there's a lot of work to do. We have to transform the way aid supply chains work. That's a big scale thing. We have to demonstrate what's possible. We've actually shown that 3D printing in the field is possible. We've done it in Haiti after the disasters there, in Nepal after the quake, and in other places as well. We use field deployments to make sure that we are very connected with local communities, and that when we say 3D printing, we actually can do that in a dusty, remote environment where maybe internet access isn't so reliable. And we also use the internet to connect and amplify our work, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. So a field deployment is kind of our key thing, and it has 5 stages, which I'm just going to quickly talk through. We work in country, and you probably can't read this, which doesn't matter, but this is just to show how complex the humanitarian environment that we work in is. Before we go in, we assess whether or not it's appropriate to work in country at all. And that means thinking about the environmental, social, political, economic, technical factors, almost all of which are disrupted in a humanitarian crisis. Trying to take all those on board, this is a really challenging operating environment. And there's international context as well as that local context, the international humanitarian standards that we need to adhere to. So we talk with local people about the problems they're having, figure out the most important ones for us to solve. We design solutions in the field, often using CAD systems because we're making products. And then we manufacture in the field. This is my colleague Mark in a camp for displaced persons in Nepal, and we're 3D printing items there powered by a truck. And you can see where some of the folks are living in the background. And we use other techniques as well as 3D printing, but 3D printing is very powerful for us because we can design something once and then use that design wherever we go. So it's design once, that's a hard challenge, but then everyone can benefit from the fact that we have a useful item that can be made anywhere. And then we train folks on the ground to use the manufacturing equipment so that it's not just a team of our experts, and we usually need humanitarians, designers and engineers in the field working together, but the local community and the relief workers can understand what we're doing. And when we have to pull our team out, we leave all of the 3D printers and materials behind so that local folks can continue to make what's needed. And that does happen. We've shown in Haiti the printers we left behind are still in active use. So it's quite a complicated ecosystem. It's not just technology. We have to think about lots of different things going on. And that makes us different from other tech for aid startups. This isn't just one product or one country or one manufacturing technique. We're really trying to change the whole humanitarian supply system. And we work in the most challenging environments at the edge. And that's a conscious choice. If we can make things there, places with basically no infrastructure, then we can make them anywhere. So we're proving the hardest case first. And the internet platforms are really key. So everything we make goes in an open catalog, so that people can reuse and modify those designs. There's a little bit of tricksy stuff in there for us because we're not just slinging 3D printable Yoda heads like many of the designs you'll find on Thingiverse or other platforms. We're making items that are essential and urgently needed by people in the field. Those designs need to be safe, they need to work, and you need to know you're going to get a successful 3D print because you don't have the option of doing 10 iterations when you're in the field with limited energy, time, and materials. So making sure that those items are certified as workable and reliable is really key. And to make those items, you've got to have some sort of machine, a 3D printer, a CNC mill, whatever it is, some sort of machine. You need to know that that machine, which may be an open hardware design itself, is going to work reliably, that it's going to work reliably in tough conditions, maybe dusty environments, in heat or cool or high altitude. And again, many of these machines might be open hardware. And we try to make sure that we understand that properly. But also, information about local manufacturing and maker facilities. We don't parachute in 3D printing equipment if there's already manufacturing gear on the ground. We try to partner with local people. And that means we need information about local manufacturing facilities. Information that in general today, we actually don't even have about the UK, let alone low infrastructure environments elsewhere. And again, for us, that's open data. We need to get that data so we can say, an injection molder who can make buckets in Nepal. Who have we got? Who's out there? So we can go and find them and work with them to make sure that local suppliers can make items if possible. All of this needs people who can use those machines and those designs, which means training and support materials. Multicultural appropriate. This isn't just a linguistic problem. It's thinking about different cultures who think about information in different ways. A lot of pictorial information because, again, we're often working with low literacy communities. And all of this open and shared with video and photos and design files, all different sorts of things. And I should say, our practice here is very early stage. We are nowhere near where we want to be. It's still a work in progress, but we know it's a place we have to go to have modular instructable materials that we can share and that others can reuse. And finally, people. We collaborate with local relief workers and communities on the ground, but we also collaborate with designers and engineers around the world. We have an open network, humanitarianmakers.org. Anyone who's a maker can sign up, and when we have a tough design challenge in the field where our field team can't solve that problem, we post that online, and the humanitarian makers, wherever they are, can look at that challenge, come up with a solution, maybe a 3D design file. CAD, by the way, is the hardest thing to train, so we generally don't attempt to train field workers in CAD tools. Maybe something else, and that can then be transmitted back to folks in the field. So it's very much a network of people helping each other out. And as well as volunteer workers, engineers in developed countries, we're also starting to get interest from makers and engineers who we've worked with in the field. Folks in Nepal, for instance, who are keen to help people in other crises elsewhere. They've got engineering skills and they want to give back. And that's a challenge for us as we start to think about the traditional model of open source, where someone in a privileged position gets to write some code or create a design and publish it openly for free and just take the credit and the glory. Things may get a little harder as we work with engineers and designers in much more challenging circumstances, even if their local region is rebuilding after a disaster. Times are hard and they may not be able to freely give everything. Maybe actually they're interested in getting some payment for their work, but they still want to help others. So interesting things for us to think about. And we're humanitarians. That's partly why we share. And in fact, when we talk about this sort of thing, when I talk to an aid agency or humanitarian audience, I don't talk about open sharing. I just talk about us sharing so that we can all benefit together. It's part of the humanitarian imperative that we're trying to support people around the world. And open licensing is a key part of that, but it's a means, not an end. So it's tough. I've talked a little bit about the difficulties of folks in maybe more and less developed countries. We've also got challenges with open hardware at all. Hardware open licensing is at a much earlier stage than working with data or content. There are different intellectual property regimes in different countries. We've also got multiple elements. A CAD design might have a certain kind of IP protection, an electronic circuit might have quite another. We've also got to think about reverse engineering and the sort of different kinds of intellectual property protections around established pieces of gear. One of the most effective things we've done in Nepal was fixing hospital equipment, high-value assets that have been donated second-hand from America. And that equipment is now obsolete. You can't buy spare parts for it anywhere. But we really need those spare parts. No one's going to send another generator or another baby warmer to the clinic we were working with. Is it okay for us to reverse engineer something so we can make new spare parts? There's interesting questions there, particularly as we get into trickier areas like spare parts for vehicles, where again the supply chains may not be working well. And the business models are just super hard. We need to make sure that we can cover the costs of shipping manufacturing equipment in. And we're starting to look now at more specialized equipment, machines that will make specific things, such as turning waste plastic water bottles into items that are regularly needed in a humanitarian context. Those machines will probably be developed in association with commercial partners, and we're going to need very subtle and careful IP agreements that both allow us to follow our humanitarian imperatives and allow our commercial partners to engage with us. So there's a lot to do, and there's a lot of collaborators for us to think about in this. It's not just FieldReady and our volunteers and humanitarian makers, it's aid agencies, it's funders like DFID, it's companies who make machines, companies who operate local factories, all kinds of stuff. So that's one example where open is affecting the kind of work I do today, but it's kind of under the hood. We don't talk about it as a big thing, but it does make a huge difference to the impact we can achieve in the world. And I want to talk briefly about the other organization I'm working with, which is Doteveryone. We want to make the internet work for everyone, including socially excluded communities who may not have an iPhone today. And we work with networks and partners to identify some of the most neglected or upcoming challenges, the moral and social challenges that are coming with the internet, perhaps issues related to work or care. And then we both do research and we make prototypes to help us really understand the problems and to help us discuss with different kinds of people the problems that we're talking about. A tangible prototype is just transformative. People can really see it and engage with it, help them think about problems that maybe had always been a bit abstract. So prototyping is key. But when we've done that research and that prototyping, we want to change the world. And so we use lobbying and influence in different ways to try to mainstream our ideas. We don't want to be the kind of think tank that produces one-off things and sits them on a shelf. We are out here to make change, and we think throughout our work about how we could influence positive change. It'll be different for every project we do, the routes to that sort of advocacy, but it is a really important part of our work. This year in 2016, our big project that I've been involved with was with the NHS, and we looked at how we could create digital tools to support better end-of-life care for older people with multiple conditions. And we did quite a lot of work. We did all kinds of different bits of prototyping, and the outputs from that, we've got some prototypes, we've got some interesting ideas we're taking forward with partners, particularly in the hospice sector, and we've also got some recommendations for how NHS technology works. We want, for example, to see Wi-Fi across the social care estate. We spent a bit of time looking at social inclusion and tools to support that, but there's a lot of innovation already. Wi-Fi across the social care estate is a high leverage intervention. It's one thing that will transform the way we can tackle social exclusion. And one of our other we also put together a package of 6 recommendations for how the NHS works with technology. These are recommendations which we're going to be using influence at the highest levels to try to get those into mainstream thought. And one of them actually is all about open source and open standards, which is really critical for technology infrastructure in the public sector and in the health service. But the word open doesn't appear in the headline. It's just not there, because that's not going to help us have an engagement with policymakers and senior executives at the Department of Health. We really need to be able to talk to them in their language and to make sure that we emphasize the things that are important to them. Open isn't important to them. Value for money and flexible and sustainable are. So our messages are converted into mainstream terms that will work for the audiences we need to influence. I should also say, sometimes everything we do is being published as openly licensed materials. That's open source on GitHub for the code. It's an openly licensed website. That's fine. We don't really talk about that. I wouldn't talk about it if I wasn't talking to this audience. And we are looking at other ways of working too. We think in the future there will be projects where we produce outputs and where some of the organizations who've supported that work get early private access for a period before we publish. So it's not 100% pure open all the time. We're thinking about business models which will enable us to do the best work. And so increasingly I see in my work that open source is a means to an end. It's not the end itself. That mainstreaming the changes we want to see in the world, both at Doteveryone and FieldReady, is far more important. So we do what open we need, but it's not the headline, it's not the big piece. And the mainstreaming is really important. I think reflecting back on my time in open knowledge and what's happened in the last couple of years, it feels like we're in a slightly different era for the open movement now. This year, if you look at the leadership changes in those flagship open organizations over the last couple of years, Open Knowledge, sure, but also the Open Data Institute, Wikimedia, Sunlight Foundation, right? Who knows Sunlight Foundation? Anyone? Sunlight is probably the world leading transparency and accountability organization, has made a huge difference, not just in America where it's based, but around the world, in helping politics be more transparent and accountable. And they are in great difficulty at the moment. They are closing programs. They are close to shutting down. They're looking for places for many of their projects to go. And I think that's symptomatic of some of the challenges we see now in what I would describe as the new era of open. It's, it's a long time to impact in open data. You get some information opened up, and then you help a community maybe find it and use it. And then that community has to decide to make change with it. Political accountability is a good example here, right? So the government has to show you what they're spending money on. And then journalists and activists have to have the skills to work with that data to figure out whether there's corruption. And let's assume that they find some dodgy practices. Someone has to stick their neck out. Someone has to say, you know what, that looks dodgy and I'm going to do something about it. That's a pretty high risk ask. It's not fun and it's not easy. And even then, you've still got to tackle the corruption. You've got to say, wow, there's corruption, we're going to change something. That is a long time scale, and it's a lot of people working really hard. And I think that's an example where we've done some of the quick wins in open. But what we have left is some really tough challenges. And as a movement, we need to be ready to face that. I mean, think what it must be like for the leaders of the open movement today. They're trying to tackle problems like that where impact is hard to show. They're trying to get money in from grant funders or maybe from donors. Grants are actually more scarce because open gets slightly more popular in certain sectors. The money doesn't necessarily grow for the field of work. So you've got to look at other business models, maybe at things that are perhaps more like compromises to some of the original values of the movement. It's not fun, it's not easy. And so I think, we've still got this vision, but I think open might be moving into a period where the projects are getting harder, and where it's not a case of sitting in a room with some friends who love open and bashing out some code, but a case of sitting in many rooms with people in suits, with people who maybe you don't get on with people who don't share necessarily your values of open, and working long and hard to achieve compromises that start moving things forward. Remember all the people who aren't in the room. This is a room full of open people, which is great. I feel at home in this sort of space. But I also work in other rooms. If I'm in a room full of relief workers and humanitarians, I will never sell open to them. They've got a cause. They know what it is. They're deeply embedded in it. And so to make them think about open stuff, I need to find ways to show that my values align with theirs, so that we can have a shared vision and shared values that is the basis for a conversation where we can then talk about the nitty-gritty technical or licensing details that are actually going to be the things that we need over the coming years to make a difference. And we need to respect that some folks work in difficult situations. I mean, heck, try working in NHS technology right now. It's no bed of roses working in a terribly austere environment with so many crises coming at you from all sides. To try to influence change there is not quick and it's not easy. People have their own priorities, and you've really got to work hard, I think, to make sure that the things that we value as the open movement can be seen to them. And that probably means not talking about open. It means talking about human rights and the other things that make up all the different ways that we express our visions for the future. I've gone over time, so I'll speed up. But I think what we've got is slow, hard, and somewhat thankless tasks ahead of us. Long projects, long battles. We've had some battles with easy wins, but what we've got ahead is tough. And I think this movement will need to start supporting each other, acknowledging that compromises will be made. The ability to be a fanatic out there on the fringes, banging on about open and the importance of specific licenses at every turn, that is not going to change the world anymore. We need people who will have those tougher conversations, and we need to support each other through long, slow, and difficult projects in the years to come. Just like, many civil rights groups today are finding new ways to support each other, because tough times are ahead in other areas too. So yeah, think about pragmatism. Open Knowledge Foundation always had this as a key value, pragmatic, not fanatic. I don't know that we've always lived it as well as said it, but I think it's really important for the phase to come. And key behaviours to keep open moving forward. Focus on the shared values, where we have things in common with people who are pursuing other goals in different sectors. And think about how we can listen to them and really hear them so that we can come up with ways forward that will enable them to change too. All that I've heard this morning is a need for change in academia, for instance. We need to think about more than just open to make that happen. And I think our values are really important today. This has been a tumultuous year politically around the world, and the kind of values that the open movement espouses are ones that many others espouse too, even if they express them in different ways. So we need to keep fighting the good fight, but remember that mainstreaming it is what matters. Not just being about open, but about making people more empowered through access to information, and making sure that we are pragmatic in how we do that. Thank you.